What happens is political power every now and again decides that it has to demonstrate that it's upstanding and clean. So what it does is it usually finds a few minor figures who've not done anything very radically wrong and expose them as corrupt figures. Now, sometimes they're hugely corrupt, as we find in the Ponzi schemes like Madoff and so on. But that was a kind of legal corruption in a way. I mean, it's very difficult to see this relationship. But the political process is, depending again where you're in the United States, the political process is legalized corruption. It already is. There are no limits on what you can do and how much you can contribute. It's now can be totally secret. You can do as you want. And of course, this means that you control the levers of political power. And the result is that, you know, citizens have almost no role to play. We're simply pawns in a game, which is all about TV images and all the rest of it, and presentation. Who has the money wins. And I think that is just the general situation. And of course, and it's not only, you know, presidents, but it's also, you know, senators and all the rest of it. I remember having a discussion with some people who were farming hogs in South Carolina, who said to me, you know, they were agitating about the fact that this was a major source of pollution, and the people there were trying to get legislation passed, and progressive people basically turned to you and said, look, we agree with you entirely, but we're not going to do it because we know perfectly well we'll lose the next election. And so there's no way we will do that because the hog farmers are very wealthy and they will simply make sure we lose the next election. So we can't pass this legislation. So this is what I mean by a totalitarian democracy. It's the community of money, as Marx calls it, which rules. And money has become the community. And it's become politics. And getting money out of politics has been impossible. In fact, almost every decision that's made makes the situation much worse. And again, that comes back to the question of the power of money in our society. One of the big problems right now is that, you know, money is something that can be created without limit. And so when there's a difficulty, the Federal Reserve just creates more money. Where does the money go? It goes into the stock market. Where does it go after that? It goes into the banks to some degree. And where does it go after that? It goes into the pockets of the billionaires. All the data in the United States show that all of that money, which has been created by the Federal Reserve, that 90% of it has gone into the pocket of the 1%. None of it is spread around into the world at large. So actually, there you have, if you like, a kind of a system which you look at it and you say, by definition, this should be called corrupt. But it's not. It's just simply the way the market has been structured and the market works. And there's nothing we can really do about it, and the influence and the political influence that flows from all of that. The only thing we can do is dismantle the Federal Reserve, stop it creating money in the way it's been creating it, and go to an alternative kind of society. But that is a big kind of question, you know. You know, there was a time when IMF and World Bank at its meetings were being sort of surrounded by people, and that doesn't seem to happen anymore. But actually, all along, I thought this is the wrong people you're going after. It should be the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Federal Reserve that should be the focus of attention. And interestingly, the only people who really are working on that are the far right. the libertarian right. They're the ones who are kind of most agitated by this, and I think the left is also to some degree involved in agitating about it, but we haven't got very far in dealing with the fact that, you know, the political process is organized like the free market in such a way that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and that's the way it is, and we are supposed to get used to it. And when I talk about a totalitarian democracy, that was a phrase that was used by Herbert Marcuse, who also used this term repressive tolerance. And he asked the question, how come we are being forced to tolerate the intolerable? And why is it that everybody preaches to us principles of toleration so that we tolerate the intolerable? And I think that that is kind of a very important question right now. We are in an intolerable situation. How come we're being told to tolerate it? And how come we're being taught ideas of toleration in a situation which is absolutely appalling?
David, você poderia falar um pouco sobre os direitos de propriedade intelectual, royalties? Você estava comentando mais cedo sobre a questão do Facebook, do Twitter, e se você pudesse também, dando um passo além, discutir de que forma a cultura pode, em sua opinião, atuar no processo anticapitalista.
Well, culture became, in the 1980s or so, culture became an industry, and it became commodified. And almost every city I know decided that culture was one of the ways in which one should think about an economic development strategy. So to develop cultural institutions, along with iconic cultural artifacts like, you know, Bilbao Museum of Gary or something like that. So culture has been commodified. It always was to some degree, but it's been intensely commodified. And cultural events have been commodified. And of course, these cultural events are sponsored. I'm very interested to see that I'm here thanks to Petrobras, which is not uncommon these days. These are part of the contradictions of being a radical. Is so yeah, culture, but within that, of course, as there is in any sphere, there are forms of protest, and those forms of protest can be politically very significant. For instance, about 2 months ago, I was in Rome, where the Italian Ministry of Culture has essentially been defunded. And the result is that all of the subsidies to theatres and so on have been cut, and many of them have gone technically bankrupt. And there's a famous theatre in Rome called Teatro Valle, where the actors and actresses and the stagehands and the management, etc., decided that they were not going to allow this theatre to be converted into a restaurant. They wanted to keep it as a theatre, and as one of them said to me, we occupied it for 3 days and we've been here 3.5 years. And we've been setting up alternative events. This has been actually a movement that has spread now to other cities like Naples and Sicily and Milan. And they were having a get-together of all of the occupied theatres that there are in Italy, and of course alternative programming goes on, and political events, and there's a good deal of politicization and social action going on around these cultural facilities, with a good deal of public support. And this particular theatre was a theatre that staged Pirandello's plays and is rather famous. So this theatre, when they occupied it and kept it as a theatre, the majority of people in Rome, I think, rallied behind the idea. Even the press, to some degree, supported it until some of the press decided that this was getting too dangerous because it was suggesting that there could be a non-commodified property market in Rome, and that was not a good idea. So, you know, I think that what is going on in cultural circles is actually a very important way in which to mount an internal critique, particularly given the way in which cultural events have been part of a political strategy to use, of a developmental strategy to use those cultural events to start to politicize around alternatives. And we see many examples of that now going on. And I think this is, again, one of the interesting areas that I think is worth looking at as a source of inspiration of what alternatives might look like, and how those alternatives might be articulated, how to decommodify culture, how to stop rents being extracted from cultural events, and how to try to turn those cultural events into moments of political agitation. And because there's always a deep ambiguity about what is meant by culture, and that in effect is something which is involved in aesthetic values, and therefore something which is sort of a wonderful field for serious agitation. And again, I think to the degree that city is a repository of many cultural artifacts, and that the city is in a way a work of art, as sometimes called of it, then the city as a whole itself, it seems to me, is something which has to be looked upon from a cultural perspective, and arguments over what it should represent and how its aesthetics should be constructed are actually very healthy arguments to have. It's not as if there's one solution, and I think that one of the things that can be cultivated in cities is an understanding of both the relationship between unity and diversity within a population. And I think, again, this is one of the ways in which it might be possible to construct a better unity within a population around the idea of organizing a whole city rather than simply organizing just this neighborhood or this sector. And this is, if you like, one of the positive lines of agitation, which seems to me is worth cultivating.
Bom, para concluir, vamos fazer uma última questão. Você defende, Harvey, o direito à cidade como um direito não apenas aos serviços urbanos, mas também como um direito à imaginação. De que maneira esse direito à cidade pode ser exercido na nossa prática urbana cotidiana? É possível, hoje, diferenciar bens e serviços públicos dos privados, das mercadorias?
The right to the city is what I call an empty signifier. That is that everybody can claim the right to the city. Capital can claim a right to the city. We have a mayor, Bloomberg, in New York, about to be displaced, who has used his right to the city in a certain kind of way, mainly to develop the city. And I don't in any way doubt that Bloomberg loves the city. He really does. It's just that he loves the city that he likes. And he feels comfortable in a city where there are not low-income people around. He feels comfortable in a city where there are people like him basically living there. He feels comfortable in a city which is full of major developmental projects. And so he has a right to the city, as do I. And the big question is, who exercises the right to the city? And as Marx once said, in a situation where there are equal rights, then between equal rights, force decides. So it then depends upon political power and political organization as to who has the right to the city. So in setting up the idea of the right to the city, it was an attempt to bring together many different organizations like the taxi drivers and the domestic workers and the like into the idea of a common cause, that we all had a common interest in what was happening in the city as a whole, and that therefore we might want to plan for an alternative city. So one of the things that we did with the right to the city movements was to sort of come up with a platform, if you like, of an alternative city. And one of the elements of the platform we considered was the role of public space and the role of commons, what we call an urban commons. And the point here is that there's lots of public space in the city which is not actually available to the public. A lot of this is space which is actually regulated by the state and regulated in such a way that behaviors are sort of legislated. What you can do in it is being legislated, and you can't assemble in that public space. Now, the idea of a public space in which you are forbidden to get together with more than 5 people because this is a political agitation is appalling, but legislation gets passed which kind of says you cannot actually use this public space in this public way. This came about particularly strongly with the bike riders group. The bike riders would occasionally do a bike-in. That is, 500 of them would get together and they would ride around the streets of Manhattan, and of course they would stop traffic. Well, after a while the city got very annoyed and kind of said you cannot have more than 6 bicycles riding together down the street, otherwise you're subject to arrest. This is actually the sort of way in which public space is being actually regulated, and it's not public. In other words, the public cannot go into a public space and do what it likes. And in fact, it turns out many public spaces are actually private or semi-private. Central